In today's episode, we talk tight ends we are buying and selling, as well as a little bit of strategy on how we try to buy and sell in general with the tight end position. Stick around for all that and more. And welcome into the Dino Construction Podcast. I'm your host, Justin, joined today again just by JP, although David will be joining with some pre-recorded remote sections. Again, I am in Germany until July, so we're having some struggles getting all together at the same time, but still want to make sure we get all of our insight in. So sorry for some of the inconsistencies. This week is all about tight ends and complementing our tier episode and theory episode. We want to give you short buy and sells. I do want to just touch a little bit on some general strategy I go about with tight end trades, talking about like a lot like QB trades where you need like a QB to get another QB, right? If you're trading for Mahomes, you need to send a quarterback and something else to get up to the elite quarterbacks, for example. I think a lot of the time it's very similar with tight ends. It's not always that way. For example, if a team has 2 or 3 really elite guys, you don't necessarily need to send a tight end back with them. But just in general, when you're trying to trade for a tight end, I think you're going to have better success if you, for example, trade Dallas Goedert and a second to try to get up to somebody else. Just throwing that name out there as a general name. Than if you are just trying to trade a second and a wide receiver for that tight end, because you're kind of filling that perceived need that the people feel like I have to replace this player. So just that's kind of my nugget. When we're going over our buy and sell candidates, a lot of the time when I'm talking about buying or selling a tight end, either maybe I'm trying to buy this tight end by packaging perhaps one of our sells for that guy, or selling a tight end by trying to tier up or tier down to another tight end that I consider to be a buy. I'm curious, JP, if you have any general insight on that, or does that sound about the same for you?
Yeah, I do think you're right. I think if you're going to acquire somebody like Mark Andrews and they're tied into somebody like Tucker Kraft, I think they're going to definitely be more inclined to make a trade with you, if you're giving somebody like a Pat Freiermuth or a Cole Kmet. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense to me. Not exactly like the quarterbacks, but I think it is pretty similar there.
Yeah, not as rigid whatsoever. And we also try not to be too rigid on our player takes, but we still do want to have some. JP, who is your first tight end buy?
So I'm going to kick us off here with Jake Ferguson. Now, last year, he was one of the guys that people had as a late round breakout candidate, and sure enough, he stepped up and he had a good year. But looking forward to this season, I think that he might even be better this year. And the reason why is because outside of CeeDee Lamb, the players that the Cowboys have are just not good. So the wide receiver 2 right now appears to be Brandon Cooks, who is a 31-year-old wide receiver who's coming off a 657-yard wide receiver season. I mean, he had bigger touchdowns. He had 8 touchdowns, so it kind of inflated. Seemed like he did better than he really did at the end of the year. But he really wasn't super involved the way that we thought he would be. And now as he gets older, I mean, there's a chance that he takes a step back, physically. And then Jalen Tolbert is our wide receiver 3. Boy, in 2022 as a rookie, he had a 0.5% target share. He could not get on the field. Yeah, less than 1. That's atrocious. And then in 2023, he had a 5.8%. So yeah, he stepped forward a little bit, but yeah, that is not good. Not good. And outside of that, it gets even worse. Kavontae Turpin and Ryan Flournoy, I don't even know how to say it. I know he was like a day.
I think it's Flournoy, and I do have him on one taxi squad, regrettably, because I couldn't get anybody else, and I sold all my players for picks. You're right. The wide receiver room is not good.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, especially if they sustain an injury to somebody like Brandon Cooks or CeeDee Lamb, God forbid. Geez, it's going to be rough. This offense, it's either going to take a huge step back in passing production, and even if they do a little bit, I think that Jake Ferguson is going to be the guy who is the number 2 target. He was last year. He was second on the team in targets, receptions, and yards. Now Michael Gallup is gone. That's another, target out of the way. Tony Pollard is gone. They bring in Zeke. I don't know if he's really going to see more targets than Pollard. Maybe he does, but they're just going to be short little dump-offs, if anything. But Jake Ferguson, he led all tight ends in red zone targets, and he only had 5 receiving touchdowns. So I think that is bound for regression. And I think his receptions, targets, all of that can go up. And actually, Dallas led the league last year in passing attempts per game. Probably will take a step back with this room, but yeah, that's still impressive.
So first of all, you get my wide receiver 1 out of your mouth with this injury talk. You get my wide receiver 1's name out of your mouth. CeeDee Lamb cannot get injured. I forbid it. That is absolutely not going to happen. But yeah, you're right. The opportunity is there. We talk about him in our tier and theory As like he's a young guy who could honestly have an amazing season with the opportunity. Could definitely be one of those undervalued tight ends as well. I can just never bring myself to buy him at the price people want because I think everyone is a little bit wise on it. In my personal leagues, like when I've reached out about him, people are like, "Oh, I really like him. I really like him. I really like him." What are you willing to pay for him? So I'm going to give you some price points. Would you pay a second and a third, 25 second, 25 third that are truly random?
Is this a tight end premium at all?
1.75, our standard format.
100% I would.
2 seconds for him.
If they're both late, I might consider it, but I'd probably rather go target Kittle for that.
Last year's champions, 25 first. You get back a random 25 second.
And a 1.75, I think I might consider it if I really think that he's the piece that I need. I think that he might have, something similar to what David Njoku had last year, where he was winning people leagues, the second half of the year. He's not quite the physical freak that Njoku is, but yeah, I mean, I'm not too worried if it's like the 112 swap for I'm getting the 206 or something back.
Yeah, I mean, you never know that it ends up the 112. There's always a chance you regret it, but obviously we've established not worth a first, worth somewhere between 2 seconds and a second and a third, just depending on where we think those seconds are going to land in a 1.75 tight end premium or higher. Below that, in a no tight end premium, we're probably looking at, would you pay a random 25 second? Do you think that's about fair price?
I think that is about fair without a tight end premium.
All right. Just want to give some actionable price advice there. And that being said, now that we've uncursed CD Lamb from any injury risk, David, who is your tight end buy?
My buy is George Kittle. Now, obviously, this is just for a competing team. So he's finished top 5 in total PPR points in 5 of the 7 seasons in his career, including 5 of the last 6. The one miss was in a season where he only played 8 games. He has been top 6 in PPR points per game from the tight end position each of the last 6 seasons, though. 4 of those were a top 3 finish. Now, he is 30. I know we don't like to see that age as a dynasty manager, but it does matter a bit more for running backs and wide receivers than it does for tight ends. Since 2008, there's been 13 times where a tight end 30 years old or older has put up over 1,000 receiving yards in a season. 12 times where one has scored at least 225 PPR points. Just for reference, that should give him a pretty darn good shot at a top 6 finish. Might even be good enough for top 3 some seasons. Some pretty productive seasons coming from older tight ends. Now, my biggest concern personally is his contract situation. I don't think he's going to play in 2025 under his current contract situation, though he is under contract for 2025. I'd be very surprised if they don't get something worked out, though, so I still expect him to be in San Francisco long term. Now, what about his value? Well, on Keep Trade Cut, he's tight end 10, and on DLF Startup ADP, he is tight end 10 as well. Both sides do have him ranked outside of the top 100 overall players, though. This means he should be available in the 9th or 10th round of startups. On both sides, we do see a gap of over 20 spots between tight end 8 and 9, which indicates a pretty big tier break there after tight end 8. I do have Kittle as my tight end 9, so I know it's not much higher positionally, but I have him in the same tier as my tight end 7, TJ Hockenson, and my tight end 8, Travis Kelce, and the market clearly does not if we're using those two as indicators. According to Keep Trade Cut, you can get Kittle for a mid-second, early second, maybe if you have to. If I'm competing, I'm definitely willing to pay that. Also see JP's tight end by Jake Ferguson right ahead of him. Evan Engram right behind him. If I'm competing, I prefer Kittle to both of those players. And the last thing, I'd also explore a tier down if I'm competing. If I have one of those elite young tight ends, I might be willing to tier down to Kittle if I can get a first on top. Now, depending on which elite young tight end that is, you might have to add a little something. You might even be able to get a little something back if it's like Laporta or McBride. If you can get a nice first on top of that, I think that could pay off and you would still get the production you'd be expecting from one of the younger tight ends. So that is why Kittle is my tight end buy.
I agree that Kittle is a guy, like when we're talking about in our tier range, there's a drop off after that tier that he's in guys that I actually really want to roster. Kittle, I don't feel that confident that he can win me a league over the course of a season. But what I do like about him is I feel 100% confident he will win me several weeks throughout the course of the season. And when you look at the guys below him, I also don't feel confident any of those guys winning me a league. So I think he's like the premier option of guys that can't win you a league, is kind of like a sort of way that I view him. I think that the price point I'm putting on him, similar to what JP said, he's not worth a first, but he's probably worth more than a second, maybe 2 seconds in a 1.75 tight end premium. So just a kind of similar-ish to that. We actually have him in the same tier as Ferguson, so that kind of makes sense.
Yeah, and they're actually like basically back-to-back on Keep Trade Cut. Kittle's 109 overall, and Jake Ferguson 111 at tight end 9 and 10. So yeah, I see them fairly similar just because of, the age is about 5 years different there. But yeah, I do like Kittle. I think that is a fair assessment. And Justin, tell us about your tight end buy.
My tight end buy, love him to death, is Evan Engram. I think this guy is going to smash just like he did last year. Now, I am very aware his underlying metrics, not that great, right? Really low yards per catch, a lot of dink and dunk stuff. But this guy is the safety blanket for a quarterback that just got extended. For that reason, I am very in on him. He was the tight end 2 last year. He was the tight end 5 the year before in 1.5, 1.75 tight end premium. I ran him in 1.2 tight end premium as well. I even ran him in half PPR to just see, because he had 100 plus receptions last year. When we're talking about other formats like half PPR, was he that much worse? No, still tight end 2. And in 2022, when he was tight end 5, he was instead tight end 6 and half PPR. So even though he's this PPR machine in even a half PPR format, he's still in that kind of difference making range. And in general, he is not that expensive, which I absolutely love. He's in that same type of range. In fact, I personally have him in the same tier that you guys were just talking about, where you can, in my opinion, if I'm taking a late first where I get back a second, I'm willing to pay that for him in tight end premium. 2 seconds in tight end premium, no problem. In a non-tight end premium, I'd even pay a mid-second and a third. He is under contract pretty much guaranteed. Like, they can't get out of this contract until 2026, which is, I mean, he's actually an unrestricted free agent at that point. He's also 32 at that point. So he's got 2 more years of some really good value, and I wouldn't be surprised if they re-sign him again after that. Personally, I could definitely see that happening, as long as it doesn't seem like he's dropping off of an age cliff, which tight ends kind of do around that point, 32, 33. But I think we're looking at a guy that we could see 3 more years, 4 more years of before he falls off. And I think we're guaranteed 2 years of really, we're seeing difference making. Like, there's no reason to think, in my opinion, like, I have him above Travis Kelce in my personal rankings. I love this guy. I'm super excited about him. Easily my buy. Very little question about it for me.
Yeah, I mean, Travis Kelce, it's not outside of the realm of possibilities that Evan Engram is better this year. I mean, he was in the second half last year. Like I highlighted in our tier video, Evan Engram, he was the tight end 2 from weeks 8 through 18, just barely behind Njoku, who had that red hot stretch. So he was great last year, and we love that price point. It's because, like, Evan Engram, he might produce similarly to Mark Andrews, but he's not valued that way, and he's only 1 year older. So I do like this buy. They have Brian Thomas Jr. coming in, but he's not guaranteed to hit. And even if he does, I don't think that's going to really hurt Evan Engram too drastically.
If anything, I see that as helping him, because it's going to take some of that pressure off. He performed well with Calvin Ridley there last year, having a really good statistical season. So I think that actually just helps between him and Gabe Davis. I think that just helps, having some over-the-top threats, helps Engram just eat underneath. Now, we've had a lot of positive energies, good vibes so far, but we can't be all good vibes. Who are you selling, JP?
Now, my sell here is TJ Hockenson. It's for a couple of reasons. One of them is the fact that he was with Kirk Cousins when he did have these great numbers this past year. Kirk Cousins was averaging 292 passing yards per game, which that would have been first in the entire NFL. And the year before, they were also one of the 6 teams that average over 260 passing yards. So I think Kirk Cousins really, really helped Hockenson a lot. We saw that once he was traded to the Vikings, he took another step from where he was with the Detroit Lions. And I think it's because Kirk Cousins and the Vikings, they're just throwing the ball all the time. Now he's not going to be playing with Kirk Cousins. So he has Sam Darnold and JJ McCarthy, as well as an ACL surgery that occurred on January 29th. They actually waited 36 days to let the MCL heal. So the ACL, they had to tend to that later. They waited another month, which does push back his timeline a little bit. So he might not be ready to go until October or November this year. And even when he does come back, he might still be 85, 90% of what he was. And I'd be betting that in November, it's probably JJ McCarthy that's the quarterback at that time. And we know that rookie quarterbacks, they have a tough time supporting just pass catching options in general. I mean, Justin Jefferson, we know he's going to get his. But then when you split up Addison and Hockenson for a rookie quarterback and a guy that I don't think is going to throw for as many yards volume as Kirk Cousins, and we need JJ McCarthy to hit, I just have some concerns. I know that his value is down a little bit. So, I mean, I think earlier in the offseason, he was really a sell because he was still valued around like tight end 5 or so. But he has dropped down, so I don't think he's a massive sell. But I just think that we're going to kind of sour on him after this year, because when he comes back, I don't think he's going to be as good as what we expect due to the situation and the ACL. So I think there's going to be a better buy window after this season. It's kind of similar It's not the exact same, but Javonte Williams, we knew he wasn't going to be good coming off the ACL surgery. He wasn't, and we really soured on him a lot. So I think there's that potential for Hockenson as well.
Yeah, and with that Javante comparison, I think we really saw a lot out of Hockenson over the last several years, right? There's a good track record of we know this guy is a really good NFL tight end. We saw one single game of really good Javante Williams ever. So I think that while, of course, there is a parallel from the injury and the lack of patience for dynasty players, I do think I agree with you that there probably will potentially be a better buy window. But the problem very often is with these situations is there'll be like a better buy window from a keep trade cut perspective. But a lot like with, like, for example, Kyler Murray, at this point, we saw with his injury, there was a buy window. The buy window that we saw like appear, for example, like in a keep trade cut value chart, didn't necessarily match up with the buy window from when we could actually buy him, right? The buy has to be at the point before like we see the value really drop off, because I think a lot of the time when we see that value really drop off, we get this kind of sunk cost fallacy that we feel like we've weathered through most of the storm. So even though we might see like people souring on him, souring him, I do worry that you won't be able to buy him, but I understand what you're saying. I think the difference between like when we're talking about like I talk about like selling Rome Odunze in our sell window because I think the community will sour on him, but we don't know that Rome Odunze is going to be good. We just think that he is. But we do know, in my opinion, that Hockenson is good. Will he be elite, like tight end 2 overall, like he was in points per game before Kirk Cousins went down? That I don't know for sure, but I think he'll be a top 5 option. Given the fact that he's like going at the 706 in non-tight end premium startups and is going in the kind of the 6th, early 7th round in a lot of tight end premium startups, at that sort of price point, I'm in.
All right, so I just want to push back a little here, JP. Hawkinson's still 26. He's top 6 in PPR points per game in each of the last 4 seasons, and he's only been in the NFL for 5. He's tied for first last year in PPR points per game before he got injured. So I know the injury and the QB change are both concerning, but hypothetically, if he were healthy and Cousins was back, he might even be the tight end 1, in my opinion. Definitely be tier 1, though. It seems more and more common each season that players recover fully from ACL surgeries. We typically see a return to play in about 9 months. Every surgery is a little different, though, so that's no guarantee. But best case scenario is he's returning early in 2025. Their head coach, Kevin O'Connell, very smart offensive mind. They have some decent options at quarterback with Sam Darnold and J.J. McCarthy. If either can provide decent QB play, I think the offense will be just fine. Getting him at tight end 8 prices and tier 3, I think that's a pretty big buy window personally. Because best case is he returns, looks like he did. They get their quarterback play figured out. He has a strong finish to the season. I think that definitely puts him in tier 2, maybe even tier 1, maybe not as 27-year-old next off season, but definitely tier 2 at least. And I think even if he has a setback and or the QB situation isn't figured out, I don't know that he drops down a tier because those are kind of baked in excuses. They do kind of provide some value insulation. So definitely a target for me in a rebuild, maybe not in a contender, but also I'm not trying to get out of him on a contender. I'm just trying to make it so I can survive without him.
Let me give you some selling prices and tell me if you would sell him to me for this. Would you sell me him for 2 seconds?
Probably not for 2 seconds.
Would you sell me him for a first where you give me back a third?
Yeah, I think I'm moving off him for a first. And I think the big question for me is that tier that we talked about with George Kittle, Ferguson, and Evan Engram. I think I'm trying to tier down there as kind of more so where my head is at. I mean, you said you like Evan Engram a lot. You heard me talk about Ferguson and David about Kittle. Would you be interested if you're competing to move down to that tier player and, pick up a second or so?
Well, actually, in our tier video, we do have Hockenson currently in the same tier as those guys.
And I don't think the market reflects that.
So I think, generally speaking, like if I could get anything to go to those guys, I would absolutely do so. Although I kind of have Hockenson a little bit higher than them. I think give me a second and I would happily go to any of those guys. Give me 2/3, I'd probably go to Engram. Give me a third, I might go to Engram. I love Engram, especially if I'm competing, just because I'd get points this year. The other two, it's just a lot harder because I hate being old, even though Kelsey is like my second most owned player.
Right, and I do think Hockenson is a good player. I don't think he's like a massive must sell. I just think that there's some of these things that I'm worried about and that is reflected in the market on keep trade cut. The guys that are after that tier we just talked about, we have those guys in the same tier as Hockenson, and that's kind of my biggest up here for against Hockenson.
Yeah, it's a tough range for sure. I feel like we've definitely set some approximate price points for it. I think I would need at least a first straight up. I wouldn't want to kick anything back, but we're kind of in that range. It's probably pretty fair valuable to get the flexibility of a 25 first for him. I think you're right there on the money in the range. Let us know in the comment below if you would take a 25 first for Hockenson, if you'd need more, if you'd buy him for that price, because I do think that's a very interesting price point. And it's one that I don't feel comfortable with, but I think is fair. That being said, David, who is your tight end sell?
Back-to-back tight end 1 finishes. Still only 25. Better quarterback this year. At least that's my sales pitch. I just think it's going to be really hard for him to repeat. So that's why Kmet is my tight end sell. They had a DJ Moore last year, but he was really the only offensive weapon that team had. So Kmet was still able to be a top 2 target earner on the team. This season they added Keenan Allen and Rome Odunze at wide receiver. They added DeAndre Swift at running back, and they signed Gerald Everett at tight end. I don't expect Everett to take Kmet's job, but he's a solid pro. And the 2-year, $12 million contract they signed him to is not an insignificant amount of money. So in these 2 tight end videos, we've been talking a lot about how you want to be a top 3 target earner on your team. I thought I'd do a little more research into that. So I looked at all of the top 12 tight ends in points per game over the last 5 seasons with at least 10 games played. Then I looked at their targets and targets per game and compared them to their teammates. And only 9 out of 60 tight end 1 seasons was the tight end lower than third on their team in targets per game, and only 7 out of 60 were they lower than third in total targets. We zoom in a little further, and only 2 out of 31 top 6 finishes was that player outside of the top 3 in targets per game. Only 1 out of 31 were they outside of the top 3 in total targets. Going a little bit further, only 1 out of 16 top 3 finishes were outside of the top 3 in targets per game, and no top 3 finishes in that span were outside of the top 3 in total targets. And remember, this is points per game that I was looking at. Now, the outlier for the top 3 finishes outside of the top 3 in targets per game, that was George Kittle in 2022. And I did include CMC's stats after he was dealt there. Otherwise, Kittle would have been third in targets per game. So with all these added weapons, I don't see a way that Kmet is top 3 in total targets or targets per game for this Bears team. Plus, they have a rookie quarterback who's not likely to support, 3, 4, 5 weapons in fantasy. So I just don't see a way Kmet is a useful fantasy player this season. Keep trade cut, he's valued around a mid-second. He's even above players like Ben Sinnott, Dalton Schultz, and Luke Musgrave. I'd definitely take the first 2 over him, probably take Musgrave as well. Definitely take the seconds over him. I think it's a good time to sell before everyone realizes that he might not even be startable.
Yeah, I do agree with David here with selling Cole Kmet. I mean, he's probably the 4th option in the passing game, and I don't love that. I don't, especially for a rookie quarterback, which we think he's going to be good. But like I mentioned with JJ McCarthy, rookie quarterbacks, they do struggle to support lots of pass catchers. And I think Rome Odunze is great. I love him more, and also Keenan are fantastic. So yeah, I would be trying to sell Kmet because I think his value is going to drop after this season. I think his value is still holding where it's at because he's young and he just came off of 2 pretty solid finishes. But those finishes really didn't help you, win any championships. I mean, finishing around the tight end 10-ish range doesn't do a whole lot for you.
Yeah, tight end 1s, it's a really sexy number to put is a tight end 1, but unless they're really top 5, 6, not so big of a deal, 100%.
All right, Justin, tell us about your tight end sell or sells.
Yeah, you know me. I'm not that smart. So when they said tight end sell, I didn't realize that was singular. I need a kind of grammar lesson. I've been living in a different country so long, I forgot how the English language works. So I picked an entire tight end room to sell. Luke Musgrave and Tucker Kraft. So these are guys that you talked a little bit about how they have some really nice aspects to their profiles in our tiers, but don't necessarily hit all the buckets that we necessarily saw make a productive wide receiver. In fact, David even talked about them as guys that he likes to buy in the tier video as well in the double-digit round of startup drafts. For me, it just comes down to the fact that, both of them have day 2 draft capital, so the team really likes both of them, and they're there competing with each other. I do think, if one of them was entirely gone, I would really like that guy, the other guy, that is. I think even if one of these guys gets injured, we're just going to be left with probably a pretty similar situation to what we're left with now, where one of them got injured, the other one performed well, and now the other one's coming back. Literally, right? Musgrave got injured, Kraft performed well, and now Musgrave's coming back, and we have a murky situation. So if one of them gets injured, we're going to probably have murkiness. If neither of them gets injured, I think we're going to have murkiness probably, because I think they're both actually good football players. And then when you add in the wide receivers of Wicks, Dobbs, Reed, and Watson, I mean, let alone the running backs in Jacobs and Lloyd. AJ Dillon's not much of a factor, but they have a lot of people there that are going to be doing a lot of things, a lot of bodies that are solid NFL players. I'm just worried about their ability to differentiate themselves. I'm taking any third for either of these guys. I do think for Musgrave, I would try to get more than a third because I think the market values him as more as that, especially in a tight end premium. My goal is probably to like tier down to somebody below him and get a third, see if I can get just a tight end that's like startable and a third, or 2/3, or can I do a 2-3 swap with Musgrave to get up to a second? You could also just ask for a second for Musgrave. Maybe you'll get it. Aim higher, perhaps. But I just am not interested in betting on either of these guys because I'm not smart enough to know who the better one is. So I have just, they're off my roster. Let me go pick up somebody else, a backup running back, a backup quarterback, or give me another tight end that I can then try to sell for a third later on if I like their profile. I just think there's so much competition there.
Yeah, I think it's the deepest wide receiver room in the entire NFL, probably. And then to have not even a clear-cut tight end, even if there was one guy that was the clear-cut starter, it probably would be hard for them to be super productive with the wide receiver room that they do have. So yeah, it's tough to see a path, but maybe one of them does separate. Even then, I still am struggling to see them, out target Jaden Reed, Christian Watson, Dontavian Wicks, and Dobbs. Even two of them, it's going to be tough. So yeah, I do agree.
No, I can't say I disagree with the logic here, Justin. You probably win more times than not taking a third for either player here. But I did just say I'd take Musgrave over Kmet, and I have them both on a rebuilder. I talked about that in our Tiers in Theory video, so I think I gotta push back a little here. At least explain my thinking a little further. The Packers offense is a good offense with a good play caller, good play designer, and a good young quarterback who we expect to sign an extension before the first snap of the season. This means we expect this offense to be pretty good for the foreseeable future. They do have a ton of talent at wide receiver and tight end, which is great for the offense, but pretty scary for fantasy. I do admit holding any Packers wide receiver or tight end is very much a gamble, but I'd argue we want to gamble on talented players on good offenses with unknown usage. It's a good way to make a cheap bet on high upside. It's possible they don't start consolidating targets until they have to pay these players, but it's also possible it happens this season. If you can guess right on their featured weapon, then you can see a big return. Now, since this offense has so many weapons, I tried to remove them from the equation to see if their tight end one usage was something that could support a fantasy relevant player. I tallied the targets in each game from their top 4 wide receivers, top 2 tight ends, and top 2 running backs. The tight end one was, on average, the third target earner in each game and was the lead target earner in 4 weeks. On top of that, the tight end one only saw 0.8 less targets per game than the wide receiver 2. And these guys were rookies. I mean, the wide receivers were young too, but the tight ends were rookies and they do take a little longer to develop in most cases. So I think there's a case that that gap could shrink even more. But this tells me that if a tight end can establish themselves as a starter and the Packers start to consolidate targets, their tight end one can make a big fantasy impact. Even if they don't consolidate the targets, he could still be a startable tight end. And honestly, because of the upside of this offense in general, I want some exposure to all of these weapons spread throughout my teams. So I can't fault you for taking a third for these guys, but I'm not taking a third for all of them. I do want some exposure.
Thank you so much for tuning in for another episode of the Dino Construction Podcast. We hope this was as useful for you as it was for us. Please make sure to like and subscribe wherever you listen or view. And from all of us here at the Dino Construction Podcast, until next time.